Before we start this off, I'm going to say I'm a fan of Genshin Impact. I like the gameplay and I like the story and I like the characters a lot. This video is just going to be basically a mini rant, but I do want to try and keep a main premise and point throughout the entire video itself. I want to discuss the game and I want to discuss the story and my issues with it because I do think it's important at the very least to talk that out. Don't get me wrong, I think Genshin Impact's story is decent. I think the story quests are where the game really excels. Some of these shining examples are Raiden's second story quest, and I do legitimately think Yelan and Zhao's fused story quest when we had the Chasm one was amazing, but there are missteps along the way that really make me dislike it. So today, let's talk about the issues and problems with Genshin Impact's story and why they're only going to get worse further down the line if they continue from this point on. Right off the bat, I do not believe, and I am firmly within the mindset that the Airman Salt tree is the worst addition to this story. I know it has significant lore impacts. I know it has significant lore implications, but the problem is that the rules were never clearly defined about it beforehand, and then when we actually got access to it, they weren't defined then. Now, I'm going to try and avoid a lot of spoilers directly, but I do want to at least bring up the mention or point that I believe if you can erase something from Airman Salt, if you can wipe something from Airman Salt, you really have to define what are the limitations. And they did. You can't completely erase your existence, and you cannot change the past. This is good. The problem is they didn't define limitations as to what it affects, who it affects, and who can do it. And this represents further down the line problems because anyone at this moment at least could theoretically do it if they have a slight inkling of divine strength. What does that mean? Does it apply to a Gnosis or just a god? Does it apply to an Adeptus or just Archon level beings or beings who interact with Archons? Can the Traveler do it? By never defining these rules so clearly, you leave it open to interpretation, and being open to interpretation for something that impactful in the story is not a good idea. Because the issue is further down the line, any stakes that are brought up, any horrible events, any eventual character misgivings could theoretically just be wiped away with an Airman Salt tree. And don't get me wrong, I understand that people may be like, oh yeah, it's unlikely to happen because they do legitimately want characters to be held accountable. They don't. Look at Scaramouche or Wanderer, whatever you chose to rename him as. He is not in any capacity ever going to have to deal with ramifications for what he did. And the issue isn't that he's not dealing with them. The issue is that we can never have the interactions we should have. The interactions between him and Raiden should have occurred, because just as he was forced to realize that he wasn't betrayed and was instead led astray by Totoro, he could have interacted with Raiden and understood that in a different perspective, and he directly did. He saw the memory. And it leaves it so weird because you have this character who knows much more and has interacted with people so many times before, but now they just can't remember him. And subsequently, as a result of that, he is an individual who really doesn't and cannot interact with other nations because of it. And then what is the point in saying this character wants to atone for their sins if they are going to wipe themselves from existence, or at least the memory of them from existence, and then go back and tell people he was responsible anyway? What is the point? You went back to square one. The journey wasn't long. It wasn't like this started out in Mondstadt. We went to Liyue, we went to Inazuma, and then finally we're back to square one in Sumeru. No, this was a 1 hour at most expedition, with half of that spent talking to NPCs. And I don't think that's fair. I don't think you can, and one of the issues I see with Genshin isn't necessarily the game's problem, it's also the community's problem, where they instead absolved him of all his misgivings. Oh, you slaughtered a bunch of people in Inazuma? Well, that's Raiden's fault. Oh, you slaughtered a bunch of people in Sumeru? Well, you know, that's Totoro's fault. No, he is an active player. He's an active character. And at this point, you need to ensure that he also has agency, and he does. If he does what he wants and he has his own goals, he's also responsible for the actions he takes along the way. He's a mishandled character, and unfortunately, despite how ironic it is, he was given the Raiden treatment, where you ended up wanting to make this giant character arc, but instead you got what was essentially one episode where they just decided to switch emotions completely. And this introduced the worst change, Airman Salt, which is basically a big eraser for Genshin's story. And even if you're going down the route and saying, yes, hey, later on, they can say, oh, this wasn't true, or we were led astray and this information wasn't accurate, that isn't good. That's not a good thing. You don't want your audience and every player questioning if every single thing in this game either A, matters, or B, is true in the first place. Because at that point, any stakes that are raised further along are completely erased because we don't know if they're stable. We don't know if somebody else is going to come by and erase them. So that's issue one. Issue two is the weird power scaling and the lack of limitation on character abilities. Now, I'm going to go off on a very weird tangent here. Avatar: The Last Airbender. If you've ever watched that show, you already know what I'm going to talk about to a degree. If you haven't, go watch it first and come back to this video. But in Avatar: The Last Airbender, you had 4 elements: air, water, earth, fire. And in the series, when we first started off, everybody could use the basic elements themselves. And one character, Aang, the Avatar, could use all 4, but he had to learn them individually. And each time he learned a new element and was going to, we had to spend basically a season in that region learning about its culture, learning about how to use it and what it takes, and how different fighting styles and stances influence your implication and ability to control that element. And that was important. Air fighters were very free-flowing, earth fighters were very rooted in their posture and unwavering. And what this meant was every time an opponent approached, you either had 5 outcomes. 1, they had no powers and as such used bows, arrows, and much more deadly in hand-to-hand combat in close quarters, or B, they had any element, fire, earth, wind, water. And yes, I get that if you're looking at and comparing it to Genshin, it seems very boring because we have 7 elements and they interact with each other. The difference is Avatar focused inherently and very, very deeply on not that the element itself matters, but on how you use it. There were so many different instances of an element being used in ways we didn't see. We were taught the basics, and as the story went on, we saw advanced techniques. Waterbenders learning how to utilize the water in people's blood to manipulate them, or the water in vines, or learning how to use sweat as a weapon. You could freeze it. Earthbenders learning how to manipulate the metal in objects and armor, or learning how to manipulate rocks and sand and turn real heavy stone into quicksand, using that to make armor. Airbenders learning how to fly or pull the air from people's lungs. You saw different ways to utilize this. Firebenders learning that they could manipulate and control fire to such an extent where it could turn into lightning. There is a very clear direction wherein early on you're taught the basics of elements and you understand one character can do one special thing and that makes them unique. That's what made Aang extremely powerful, but every other character can specialize to such a degree that they are all different threats of varying degrees, with the respective kings and lords of the land or the older individuals being incredibly powerful. With Genshin Impact, every character has one vision, except we never see how they really use that vision in their day-to-day life, so we don't know the implications of what it means to really have an Anemo vision. What can you really do aside from combat? Is Zhao being able to teleport at an Anemo scale or an Adeptus scale? Further along, we haven't seen any advanced techniques. We don't know if Zhongli has any random geo powers he just hasn't showed to us aside from his sealing techniques. And with Nahida, because she's connected to the Airman Salt, everything she says is taken as fact, when realistically she's connected to it. She doesn't have access to all the information at all times. That's why she needed us to go in. But her saying the top 3 Fatui Harbingers are on the level of gods has entirely shaken up how people view the Fatui, because they take it as her saying they're on the level as Raiden and Zhongli. Objectively speaking, that is not the definition of what she said. We've seen gods like Guizhong be killed in battle. We've seen gods like Havria died at human hands. A weakened Osayo taken out by a Jade Chamber, as well as Beisht. That statement holds no water long term, and when you don't have that ability for us as readers and watchers to really say who's the strongest in the room at the moment, we don't know what's at stake. I can't tell if something's at stake when Signora and Zhongli are in a room, or when something like the Torre and Zhongli are in the room. What's the difference? Is God being any god, or is it specifically referring to Archon level gods? Because let's be real here, we've seen different levels of strength. Venti was able to flatten Mondstadt before receiving the Gnosis. Zhongli made islands everywhere of stone spears before receiving his Gnosis. I'm pretty sure when Raiden cut Orobashi in half, Makoto was alive, which meant that Makoto had the Gnosis and Raiden didn't. We've seen the Surumi Island bird nuke his entire population, forced time to rewind consistently so they had to repeat the same day over and over again, and then when he was killed, he nuked another island. We've seen these large-scale effects from different gods, so I can't take her statement as anything other than the game, and then Hoyoverse himself saying, we want to make characters however we want to make them and as strong as we want them. And that's not good, because we don't have defined rules and defined power levels for what strength level a character can reach. Nobody who's watching understands what's at stake, who's the strongest, and who has the most influence at that time. I am perfectly fine with somebody like Capitano being really strong, but the other Fatui Harbingers having more influence in other ways. Hypothetically, Pantaloon has such financial influence that he can oppose Ning Guang. That is an interesting thing, because a character can't rely solely on their strength, they have to rely on their intellect. But the Airman Salt tree and the Nahida statement and all of this retconning does end up with situations where the story just feels flat, because I don't know what's at stake. I don't know who's the strongest. I don't know what the situation is. I don't know what the elements even mean at this point. And with Hoyoverse wanting to introduce another faction every 5 minutes, it doesn't really matter. Oh, here's Celestia. The last time we saw Celestia was 3 years ago. And at this point, I'm more inclined to say that the good guys, because yes, they sealed our powers away, but they could have killed us. And that was after the Cataclysm. At the same time, we've seen them destroy civilizations here and there with the random nail on Dragonspine, but they never turned anybody into Hilichurls. So I'm more inclined to believe that was from the twin. But Celestia has been pretty chill, all things considered. You have the Abyss, you have the Fatui, you have the Vishaps and Dragons, you have the 7 Archons, you have whatever power the Abyss gets from, or whatever darkness is outside of Teyvat that influence dragons. You have so many factions, including Conrir, which is going to be technically separate from the Abyss at this point. You have so many different factions in the Emirites and all of these different areas that it's very difficult to really say, yeah, this story makes sense. Or yeah, this is the big bad of this region. When Fontaine arrives, if we get another set of villains and another set of antagonists, I'm just giving up, because this story isn't finishing off what it started. The Fatui haven't been dealt with. The Archons and Celestia haven't been dealt with. We have so many active threats and so many active threads that the story isn't giving any one of them enough time to really shine. And with the absolvement of each Fatui Harbinger, like I can respect Child because he's always been just a guy who likes to fight. That's it. But Scaramouche getting this weird redemption arc for like an hour that suddenly makes him seem like he's a hero, especially with how he received his vision, it doesn't feel right with me. But what are your thoughts? What do you think? I think Genshin's story is declining. I think Mondstadt Liyuan, to a degree, I even say half of Inazuma was really good. But I think as of right now, events are fun though. Lantern Knight is pretty chill.